July 14th, 1456. The morning mist rising from the Danube River carried with it the sound of 80,000 men preparing for war. From the walls of Belgrade fortress, a single knight watched the greatest military machine on earth converge on his position. John Hunyadi, regent of Hungary and terror of the Ottoman Empire, faced a decision that would haunt military strategists for centuries. To save his city, he would have to destroy it. To defeat 80,000 warriors, he would unleash the rivers themselves as weapons of war. The numbers alone told the story of impossibility. Belgrade's garrison numbered barely 5,000 men, a mix of Hungarian regulars, Serbian militia, and a handful of knights who had answered Hunyadi's desperate call. Against them marched the cream of Ottoman power. Fresh from their conquest of Constantinople just 3 years earlier, Sultan Mehmed II's forces represented the cutting edge of medieval warfare. The young sultan, barely 24 years old, had already earned the title conqueror by smashing the walls that had protected Byzantium for 1,000 years. Now, he turned that same devastating power toward the gateway to Christian Europe. Picture this scene unfolding in the summer heat of 1456. Belgrade sat at the confluence of two great rivers, the Danube flowing eastward toward the Black Sea, and the Sava joining it from the south. This wasn't mere geography. It was strategy made manifest in stone and water. Every trader, every army, every diplomatic mission between Europe and the Ottoman Empire passed through this bottleneck. Control Belgrade, and you controlled the fate of kingdoms stretching from Vienna to Rome. Hunyadi understood the stakes better than any man alive. At 50 years old, he had fought the Ottomans in over 20 major battles, earning the nickname the White Knight of Wallachia for his distinctive armor and seemingly supernatural ability to appear wherever Ottoman forces threatened Christian lands. His reputation preceded him across both empires. Ottoman mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. Christian lords whispered prayers of gratitude that such a man defended their frontiers. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Hunyadi's flooding plan. This wasn't a desperate gamble conceived in panic as enemy forces approached. For 8 years, since his crushing defeat at the Battle of Kosovo in 1448, the White Knight had been studying these rivers, mapping their seasonal flows, identifying every dam, mill, and water control structure within 50 miles of Belgrade. He had transformed the Danube itself into a potential weapon, one that no Ottoman engineer could detect or counter. The moral complexity of the decision tore at every defender. To flood the Ottoman camp, Hunyadi would have to destroy the very infrastructure that fed and powered Belgrade. Mills that ground grain for the city's bread. Dams that controlled flooding during spring freshets. Fish weirs that provided protein for thousands of civilians. The White Knight was asking his people to choose between immediate survival and long-term prosperity. Many would die either way. Yet Mehmed's approaching army left no room for half measures. Ottoman scouts reported forces beyond anything previously assembled for a single campaign. The Janissary Corps alone numbered 5,000 men, elite infantry recruited as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained to a level of discipline that made Roman legions seem amateur by comparison. Behind them marched 15,000 Sipahi cavalry, their curved sabers glinting in the morning sun. Supporting these professionals came 60,000 irregular troops, Anatolian farmers, and Balkan auxiliaries, who fought with the desperate courage of men seeking plunder and paradise. The artillery train stretched for miles along the dusty roads leading to Belgrade. 300 cannons of varying sizes, including the massive siege mortars that had reduced Constantinople's walls to rubble. Master gunners from across the empire accompanied their bronze and iron monsters, men who could place a cannonball through a window at 800 paces. The largest of these weapons required teams of 40 oxen to move and could fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. As July 14th dawned and Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon, Hunyadi gave his final orders to the engineers waiting by the river controls. Tonight, when darkness concealed their movements, They would begin the systematic weakening of every structure that held back the Danube's summer flow. By morning, 80,000 of the world's finest warriors would discover that their enemy wasn't just one determined knight, but the rivers themselves turned against them. The White Knight had chosen to flood his own city rather than surrender it to the Sultan's ambition. What emerged from the morning mist would be the most audacious use of environmental warfare in medieval history. The first Ottoman vessels appeared on the Danube at dawn on July 15th, their crimson banners snapping in the river breeze like drops of blood against the morning sky. 200 ships stretched along the water, a floating city that dwarfed anything Christian Europe could assemble. The largest galleys measured over 150 feet in length, their bronze rams capable of splitting enemy vessels like kindling. From Belgrade's walls, defenders watched in stunned silence as this armada deployed with precision that spoke of decades conquering waterways from the Black Sea to the Aegean. Mehmed II himself rode at the head of the land forces, his white stallion prancing as if eager for battle. At 24, the Sultan radiated the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His conquest of Constantinople had shocked the world, proving that no walls, however ancient or blessed, could withstand Ottoman determination. Now he brought that same devastating expertise to Belgrade, along with innovations that would revolutionize siege warfare. His engineers had spent 3 years perfecting mobile artillery platforms that could traverse any terrain, while his janissaries carried the newest arquebus designs, weapons that could punch through plate armor at 200 paces. By midday, the Ottoman deployment revealed its terrifying scope. The Janissary Corps established their camp with geometric precision, each tent positioned according to regulations refined through countless campaigns. These men, recruited as children from Christian families and molded into Islam's perfect warriors, moved with synchronized efficiency that unnerved even veteran defenders. Their distinctive white felt caps bobbed like sea foam as they constructed field fortifications that would shame professional engineers. Behind them, Sipahi cavalry patrolled in formation, their horses trained to fight as extensions of their riders' will. But here's what the Byzantine chronicles don't tell you about Mehmed's true innovation. The Sultan hadn't simply brought an army to Belgrade, he had transported an entire weapons laboratory. Master craftsmen from Damascus worked alongside German renegades and Hungarian prisoners, combining metallurgical secrets that had taken centuries to perfect. The result was artillery unlike anything Christian defenders had faced. The Great Turkish Bombard, requiring 16 oxen to position, could hurl 1,200-pound stone balls with enough force to pulverize castle walls built to withstand conventional catapults. As the sun reached its peak on July 15th, the Ottoman artillery demonstration began. The first salvo shattered the afternoon quiet, with a sound like the breaking of heaven itself. Limestone dust erupted from Belgrade's ancient walls as massive stones struck with mathematical precision. Each impact sent tremors through the fortress that rattled teeth and loosened roof tiles throughout the city. Serbian civilians, many of whom had lived through previous sieges, recognized something different in these cannons. This wasn't the random bombardment of medieval warfare, but systematic destruction calculated to break both stone and spirit. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical damage. Ottoman engineers had positioned their batteries to create crossfire patterns that left no corner of Belgrade safe from artillery. Defenders crouching behind supposedly secure ramparts found themselves targeted by guns they couldn't even see. The constant thunder of bronze cannons merged with the whistle of 12-pound balls to create a symphony of terror that drove civilians deep into cellars and storage chambers. Then everything changed when Mehmed's personal standard appeared on the heights overlooking the confluence. The Sultan had chosen to direct this siege personally, a decision that sent ripples of fear through both camps. When the conqueror of Constantinople took personal command, cities fell. His presence transformed a military operation into a statement of imperial will that brook no compromise. What the young sultan didn't realize was that his enemy had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this moment, and the Danube itself was about to become a weapon. The engineering challenge that faced Hunyadi on the night of July 16th would have defeated lesser men entirely. To weaponize the Danube against 80,000 Ottoman warriors, he needed to redirect two of Europe's most powerful rivers without alerting enemy scouts positioned barely 300 yards from the critical dam structures. Every millstone wheel, every water gate, every wooden sluice that controlled seasonal flooding had to be secretly weakened while Ottoman sentries watched from elevated positions along the riverbank. Picture the moral complexity that tore through Belgrade's population as Hunyadi's engineers explained their plan. Master miller Jovan Milanovic, whose family had operated the Danube mills for 4 generations, listened in horror as Hungarian sappers outlined which structures would be sacrificed. These weren't just mechanical devices, they were the economic lifeblood of 10,000 civilians, the grain mills that fed the city's bread ovens, the fish weirs that provided protein through winter months, the flood controls that prevented spring torrents from drowning entire districts. Hunyadi was asking his people to choose between certain economic devastation and possible annihilation. The work began at midnight, conducted in absolute silence, while Ottoman campfires blazed less than a crossbow shot away. Hungarian engineers had spent years studying these water controls, mapping every timber brace and stone foundation that channeled the Danube's tremendous force. Now, they moved like ghosts through structures their grandfathers had built, systematically weakening support beams and loosening the iron pins that held massive wooden gates in position. Each saw cut, each loosened bolt, brought them closer to unleashing forces that could reshape the battlefield itself. Here's where legend meets reality in the chronicles of medieval warfare. Hunyadi's flooding strategy wasn't born of desperation, but of intimate knowledge gained through decades fighting along these riverbanks. As a young knight, he had watched spring freshets turn peaceful meadows into torrents capable of sweeping away entire cavalry formations. The White Knight had witnessed autumn storms transform shallow crossing points into death traps that drowned hundreds of Ottoman raiders. Now he would recreate those natural disasters on command, using the rivers as his ultimate weapon. By dawn on July 17th, the hidden preparations were complete. Every critical water control within 5 miles of Belgrade had been compromised, ready to fail at the first significant pressure. Hungarian observers positioned along the heights reported that Ottoman engineers remained oblivious to the trap being prepared beneath their feet. Enemy commanders continued positioning their massive artillery pieces in low-lying areas near the riverbank, exactly where Hunyadi wanted them when the waters rose. The moral weight of the decision pressed heavily on every defender. Serbian Patriarch George Brankovic spent the morning hearing confessions from men who knew they might be ordering the destruction of their own homes. Farmers whose families had worked these river meadows for centuries wept openly as they prepared to flood fields that had fed Belgrade for generations. Yet the alternative remained unthinkable. If Belgrade fell, Mehmed's armies would pour through the Danube Gap toward Vienna and beyond. Then came the moment that would define both siege and sultan. At precisely noon on July 17th, as Ottoman batteries prepared for their largest bombardment yet, Hunyadi gave the order that 8 years of planning had built toward. Hungarian engineers struck their hammers against the weakened supports, and the Danube began its transformation from highway to weapon. The first wooden gate buckled, then collapsed entirely, releasing a torrent that would reshape not just the battlefield, but the future of two empires. What emerged next would prove that sometimes saving civilization requires the courage to destroy everything you've built to protect it. The first torrent struck the Ottoman camp at 12:47 in the afternoon, a wall of brown water 30 feet wide that swept through their artillery positions like the fist of an angry god. Master Gunner Hassan Pasha, positioning his prize bombard for the final assault on Belgrade's walls, heard the roar too late. In 17 seconds, water traveling at 20 miles per hour slammed into bronze cannons worth a king's ransom, toppling them into muddy craters and ruining gunpowder supplies that had taken months to accumulate. The great Turkish bombard, Mehmed's pride, that had shattered Constantinople's walls, disappeared beneath churning rapids that transformed the battlefield into a nightmare of mud and drowning men. Within the first hour, chaos consumed the Ottoman war machine. 15,000 troops found themselves trapped between rising water and the steep riverbanks they had chosen for protection against Christian sorties. Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry, who prided themselves on discipline under any conditions, broke ranks as water reached their waists and continued climbing. Their distinctive white caps bobbed like funeral flowers on a current that showed no mercy between Christian slave and Muslim freeman. Picture the scene from Mehmed's command position as his perfectly ordered siege dissolved into panic. The Sultan watched his artillery park, representing years of imperial investment and engineering genius, vanish beneath waters that seemed to rise with supernatural speed. Communications collapsed as mounted messengers found every ford impassable and every bridge swept away. The Ottoman army stretched along 5 miles of riverbank, fragmented into isolated groups, fighting not Christian defenders, but the Danube itself. Here's where the chronicles reveal the true horror of environmental warfare. This wasn't clean death by sword or arrow, but drowning in armor that became anchors, suffocation in mud, mixed with the corpses of men and horses, hypothermia in water that leached body heat, even in July's blazing sun. Ottoman veterans who had stormed the walls of Constantinople found themselves clawing desperately at slick riverbanks, while their commanders screamed orders that no one could hear above the water's roar. The psychological destruction proved as devastating as the physical carnage. Elite Sipahi cavalry, trained from childhood to fear nothing but dishonor, fled in terror from an enemy they couldn't fight with scimitar or lance. Hungarian observers reported Ottoman officers attempting to maintain formation even as water reached their horses' bellies, only to abandon their posts when entire units simply vanished beneath the surface. By evening, the military mathematics that had seemed so favorable to Mehmed's cause underwent catastrophic revision. 20,000 Ottoman warriors lay dead or missing, drowned in water that showed no distinction between commander and common soldier. The artillery train that was supposed to reduce Belgrade's walls to rubble instead lay scattered across 5 miles of muddy riverbed, bronze cannons transformed into monuments to the Danube's power. But here's what the Ottoman survivors didn't realize as they struggled toward higher ground. Hunyadi's flooding strategy had only begun to reveal its true genius. The waters that destroyed the Sultan's siege equipment also cut off every retreat route, trapping the remaining Ottoman forces on a shrinking island of dry ground with Belgrade's walls to their front and rising rivers on 3 sides. Mehmed the Conqueror, who had never known defeat, faced the unthinkable reality that nature itself had turned against his imperial ambitions. The young Sultan, who had seemed destined to conquer Europe, discovered that some fortresses defend themselves. Dawn on July 18th revealed a battlefield transformed beyond recognition, where Ottoman pavilions had stood in perfect geometric precision 24 hours earlier. Only scattered debris marked the locations of drowned encampments. The Danube, swollen with diverted tributaries, had receded enough to expose the true scope of Hunyadi's environmental warfare. Across 5 miles of muddy flats, bronze cannons lay half-buried like the ribs of some metallic leviathan, while the bodies of 23,000 Ottoman warriors bore witness to the river's indiscriminate appetite. Mehmed II surveyed the devastation from his relocated command post, his young face bearing an expression that chroniclers would later describe as the first doubt ever seen in the conqueror's eyes. The Sultan, who had reduced Constantinople's legendary walls to rubble, found himself staring at an enemy he couldn't siege, couldn't storm, couldn't negotiate with. The Danube itself had become Belgrade's ultimate defender, and no amount of imperial gold could purchase victory over running water. The human cost revealed itself with appalling clarity as rescue parties began the grim work of recovery. Ottoman engineers, the master craftsmen who had perfected siege warfare across 3 continents, lay tangled among their own artillery pieces. Janissary officers, men whose tactical genius had conquered cities from Cairo to Budapest, had drowned alongside common foot soldiers when their elaborate formations became death traps in rising water. The elite Sipahi cavalry, pride of Ottoman arms, suffered proportional losses that would cripple the empire's mounted strength for years. Here's what the Byzantine sources don't tell you about the psychological damage inflicted on Ottoman morale. These weren't green recruits experiencing their first defeat, but veterans who had followed Mehmed's banners through a decade of uninterrupted victories. Men who had planted crescents above the Hagia Sophia now questioned whether Allah himself had turned against their enterprise. Whispers spread through the surviving ranks that Belgrade was protected by supernatural forces, that Christian prayers had somehow turned the rivers into weapons of divine retribution. From Belgrade's walls, Hungarian defenders watched their enemies' systematic withdrawal with emotions that mixed triumph with exhaustion. Hunyadi's garrison had lost fewer than 800 men during the entire siege, casualties that seemed miraculous when measured against Ottoman losses. Yet the White Knight himself bore the weight of difficult knowledge. His flooding strategy had sacrificed the economic infrastructure that sustained 30,000 civilians. The mills, dams, and fish weirs that fed Belgrade lay in ruins, their destruction purchasing victory at a price that would burden the city for decades. The strategic implications rippled outward from the Danube confluence, like stones thrown into still water. Mehmed's invasion of Hungary, planned as a lightning campaign to reach Vienna before winter, collapsed with the loss of his artillery train. Without the siege cannons that had made Ottoman armies irresistible, the Sultan faced the prospect of fighting a defensive war against Hungarian forces that now knew Ottoman weakness. The psychological momentum that had carried Ottoman arms across 3 continents stalled on the muddy banks where Hunyadi's gamble had paid its impossible dividends. By afternoon, Ottoman trumpets sounded the retreat that no one had thought possible. The army that had seemed destined to plant crescents above Vienna's cathedral began its long withdrawal toward Constantinople, carrying wounded pride alongside their actual casualties. Mehmed himself sustained a crossbow bolt through the thigh during the final skirmishing, a wound that would remind him daily of the limits even conquerors must respect. As evening fell onto July 18th, church bells rang across Christian Europe with news that the unstoppable Ottoman tide had finally met its match. One knight's willingness to flood his own city had purchased Christianity a generation of breathing space, proving that sometimes the greatest victories require the courage to destroy everything you've sworn to protect. The aftermath of Belgrade's siege echoed through the halls of power from Vienna to Constantinople, reshaping the strategic landscape of 2 continents. Within 6 months, the psychological damage to Ottoman prestige manifested in ways that military planners had never anticipated. Hungarian nobles, who had prepared to flee westward instead, began organizing counter-offensives against Ottoman frontier fortresses. The impossible had become possible, and Christian Europe remembered what victory tasted like after decades of retreat. Mehmed II never fully recovered from the wounds to both body and pride sustained at Belgrade's walls. The crossbow bolt that pierced his thigh during the withdrawal healed within weeks, but the knowledge that his armies could be defeated by environmental warfare haunted the young sultan for the remainder of his reign. Ottoman military doctrine, previously focused on overwhelming force and superior artillery, underwent fundamental revision as engineers scrambled to develop countermeasures against water-based defenses. The empire that had seemed unstoppable discovered the humbling reality that some fortresses could not be taken by conventional assault. The tactical innovations pioneered at Belgrade spread throughout European military thought with remarkable speed. Hungarian engineers shared their flood control methodologies with Austrian and Polish fortification experts, creating a new school of defensive warfare that emphasized geography as much as masonry. Italian Renaissance military theorists studied Hunyadi's river diversion techniques, adapting them for Mediterranean coastal defenses. The principle that natural forces could be weaponized against superior numbers became foundational doctrine that influenced fortress design for centuries. Here's where the legacy transcends military history and enters the realm of strategic psychology. Belgrade's successful defense proved that Ottoman expansion was not divinely ordained, that the empire's armies could be defeated through intelligence and preparation rather than simple heroics. This knowledge transformed European resistance from desperate last stands into calculated campaigns. The siege that was supposed to open the road to Vienna instead marked the beginning of Ottoman strategic overextension, as the Sultan's forces found themselves fighting defensive actions against enemies who no longer feared Islamic invincibility. The human cost of Hunyadi's strategy continued reverberating through Belgrade's civilian population for decades. The mills, dams, and water control systems destroyed during the flooding took nearly 20 years to rebuild, during which time the city's economy struggled to support its pre-siege population. Yet chroniclers noted that no Belgrade resident questioned the trade-off. Economic hardship seemed a small price for avoiding the fate that had befallen Constantinople's civilians just 3 years earlier. John Hunyadi himself died less than a month after his greatest triumph, succumbing to plague contracted during the siege's aftermath. The White Knight's funeral became a celebration of Christian resistance that drew mourners from across Europe. His tactical legacy lived on through his son Matthias, who would later become King of Hungary and expand his father's defensive innovations into offensive campaigns that pushed Ottoman forces back across the Balkans. Military academies still study Belgrade's siege as the definitive example of environmental warfare successfully employed against numerically superior forces. The battle demonstrates how intimate knowledge of local geography, combined with willingness to sacrifice short-term assets for long-term survival, can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Modern strategic doctrine recognizes Hunyadi's flood gambit as one of history's most audacious uses of asymmetric warfare, proving that creative application of available resources often trumps conventional military superiority. The Danube still flows past Belgrade's ancient walls, carrying with it the memory of that July morning when one knight's decision to flood his own city changed the trajectory of two empires. 80,000 Ottoman warriors had marched toward what seemed like inevitable victory, only to discover that some defenders will sacrifice everything rather than surrender. Sometimes saving civilization requires the courage to destroy everything you've built to protect it, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is the willingness to turn your own homeland into a battlefield that favors no one but rewards only the truly desperate.